Books on Tape presents The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, by T.J. Stiles. Read by Mark Deakins. Part 1. Captain, 1794 to 1847. He is striking at everything. I am afraid of this man. Thomas Gibbons, December 12, 1822. I'd sooner have him with us than against us. William Gibbs McNeill, November 14, 1840. That Vanderbilt is a great... You must fill in the blank. Cortlandt Palmer, December 16, 1841. Chapter 1. The Islander. They came to learn his secrets. Well before the appointed hour of 2 o'clock in the afternoon on November 12, 1877, hundreds of spectators pushed into a courtroom in Lower Manhattan. They included friends and relatives of the contestants, of course, as well as leading lawyers who wished to observe the forensic skills of the famous attorneys who would try the case. But most of the teeming mass of men and women, many fashionably dressed, crowding in until they were packed against the back wall, wanted to hear the details of the life of the richest man the United States had ever seen. The trial over the will of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the famous, notorious Commodore, was about to begin. Shortly before the hour, the crowd parted to allow in William H. Vanderbilt, the Commodore's eldest son, and his lawyers, led by Henry L. Clinton. William, glancing carelessly and indifferently around the room, removed his overcoat and comfortably settled himself in his chair, the New York Times reported. Meanwhile, his lawyers shook hands with the opposing team, led by Scott Lord, who represented William's sister, Mary Vanderbilt LeBeau. At exactly 2 o'clock, the judge, called the surrogate in this surrogate court, strode briskly in from his chambers through a side door, stepped up to the dais, and took his seat. "Are you ready, gentlemen?" he asked. Lord and Clinton each declared that they were, and the surrogate ordered, "Proceed, gentlemen." Everyone who listened as Lord stood to make his opening argument knew just how great the stakes were. "The House of Vanderbilt," the Times headlined its story the next morning. "A railroad prince's fortune, the heirs contesting the will, a battle over $100 million. The only item in all that screaming type that would have surprised readers was the Times' demotion of Vanderbilt to Prince, since the press usually dubbed him the Railroad King. His fortune towered over the American economy to a degree difficult to imagine, even at the time. If he had been able to sell all his assets at full market value at the moment of his death in January of that year, he would have taken 1 out of every $20 in circulation, including cash and demand deposits. Most of those in that courtroom had lived their entire lives in Vanderbilt's shadow. By the time he had turned 50, he had dominated railroad and steamboat transportation between New York and New England, thus earning the nickname Commodore. In the 1850s, he had launched a transatlantic steamship line and pioneered a transit route to California across Nicaragua. In the 1860s, he had systematically seized control of the railroads that connected Manhattan with the rest of the world, building the mighty New York Central Railroad system between New York and Chicago. Probably every person in that chamber had passed through Grand Central, the depot on 42nd Street that Vanderbilt had constructed, had seen the enormous St. John's Park freight terminal that he had built, featuring a huge bronze statue of himself, had crossed the bridges over the tracks that he had sunk along 4th Avenue, a step that would allow it to later blossom into Park Avenue, or had taken one of the ferries, steamboats, or steamships that he had controlled over the course of his lifetime. He had stamped the city with his mark, a mark that would last well into the 21st century, and so had stamped the country. Virtually every American had paid tribute to his treasury. more fascinating than the fortune was the man behind it. Lord began his attack by admitting that it seemed hazardous to say that a man who accumulated $100 million and was famous for his strength of will had not the power to dispose of his fortune. His strength of will was famous indeed. Vanderbilt had first amassed wealth as a competitor in the steamboat business, cutting fares against established lines until he forced his rivals to pay him to go away. The practice led the New York Times, a quarter of a century before his death, to introduce a new metaphor into the American vernacular by comparing him to the medieval robber barons who took a toll from all passing traffic on the Rhine. His adventure in Nicaragua had been, in part, a matter of personal buccaneering, as he explored the passage through the rainforest, piloted a riverboat through the rapids of the San Juan River, and decisively intervened in a war against an international criminal who had seized control of the country. His early life was filled with fistfights, high-speed steamboat duels, and engine explosions. His latter days were marked by daredevil harness races and high-stakes confrontations. It was this personal drama that moved that crowd of spectators into the courtroom 11 months after his death, but more thoughtful observers mulled over his larger meaning. Vanderbilt was an empire builder, the first great corporate tycoon in American history. Even before the United States became a truly industrial country, he learned to use the tools of corporate capitalism to amass wealth and power on a scale previously unknown, creating enterprises of unprecedented size. He has introduced Caesarism into corporate life, wrote Charles Francis Adams, Jr. Vanderbilt is but the precursor of a class of men who will wield within the state a power created by it, but too great for its control. He is the founder of a dynasty. Adams did not mean a family dynasty, but a line of corporate chiefs who would overshadow democratic government itself. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Gould, Morgan, all were just beginning their careers when Vanderbilt was at his height. They respected and followed his example, though they would be hard-pressed to match it. Few laws had constrained him. Few governments had exceeded his influence. In the 1850s, his personal role in Central America had been more important than that of the White House or the State Department. In 1867, he had stopped all trains into New York City from the west to bring the New York Central Railroad to its knees. In 1869, he personally had abated a panic on Wall Street that threatened to ring in a depression. His admirers saw him as the ultimate meritocrat, the finest example of the common man rising through hard work and ability. To them, he symbolized America's opportunities. His critics called him grasping and ruthless, an unelected king who never pretended to rule for his people. Still worse, they saw him as the apex of a vulgar new culture that had cast off the Republican purity of the Revolution for the golden calf of wealth. "You seem to be the idol of a crawling swarm of small souls," Mark Twain wrote in an open letter to Vanderbilt, "who sing of your unimportant private habits and sayings and doings as if your millions gave them dignity." Perhaps there were those who understood that Vanderbilt's true significance was more complex, even contradictory. How could it not be? His life spanned a period of breathtaking changes, from the days of George Washington to those of John D. Rockefeller, with whom he made deals. He began his career in a rural, agricultural, essentially colonial society in which the term businessman was unknown. He ended it in a corporate, industrial economy. Neither the admirers nor the critics of his later years had witnessed his role during the tumultuous era of the early Republic and the antebellum period. They could not see that Vanderbilt had spent most of his career as a radical force. From his beginnings as a teenage boatman before the War of 1812, he had led the rise of competition as a virtue in American culture. He had disrupted the remnants of the 18th century patricians, shaken the conservative merchant elite, and destroyed monopolies at every step. His infuriated opponents had not shared his enthusiasm for competition. Rather, the wealthy establishment and that young
Sample complete. Ready to continue?